Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Howard Emery back again. Howard has been giving us a series of presentations about birds, and today's conversation is about conservation. And Janet, his wife, has already told us it's going to be a good one because she's already heard it. So welcome, Howard. Welcome, Janet. And we look forward to your presentation. I'll make it full screen here right now.
Well, welcome, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here again. And we'll see if we can get through this. I'm going to start with a poem by Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold was a naturalist and author whose writings called attention to the destruction of the natural environment and the effects on bird populations. This is from 1947. Men still live, who in their youth remember pigeons. Trees still live, who in their youth were shaken by a living wind. But a few decades hence, only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last, only the hills will know. He was speaking about the passenger pigeons. In 1895, a 65-year-old Native American wrote of an experience he remembered from when he was 20 years old in 1850, while camping at the headwaters of the Manistee River in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, when he heard a sound coming from the forest on a clear, calm, and beautiful morning, which he described as like an army of horses with sleigh bells, and then a flock of what he described as millions of passenger pigeons flying through the forest. 1850. Others have described. Oh, let's go to the pigeon. Sorry. So the third slide, the next one, is the passenger pigeon. Obviously, a spectacular bird, and to have millions of these birds, you can see, would be inspirational and also problematic because when they're in those numbers. In any event. Others have described the migrating flocks taking hours to pass over one spot with such a noise as to interfere with conversation. Can you imagine millions of birds flying over your head, taking hours to pass? It's unbelievable. Around the mid-19th century, they were believed to be the most abundant bird in North America and possibly the world. Now we're going to go back to the previous slide. These passenger pigeons, this is only a small cloud, obviously, but you can see the hunters out here slaughtering the birds as they fly overhead in large numbers. You couldn't miss. That was a major source of the problem. The range of the passenger pigeons in the next slide, and be 2 slides over. Well, that's the poem. The next, there you go. The range of the passenger pigeons shows their breeding grounds in the upper northeast part of the country and around the Great Lakes. In 1871, one of their great communal nesting sites, if you can imagine this, covered 850 square miles of Wisconsin's Sandy Oak Barrens. This is one communal nesting site, 850 square miles, wow. Estimated by the naturalist A.W. Schorger to include 136 million breeding adults. Non-breeding birds extended across the eastern United States to the Missouri River and south to the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see the range of the breeding range in the red, and then the extended range during the rest of the season. Success as a species and also their vulnerability was enhanced by the habit of moving about in these great numbers. This would scare off predators and dominated the competition for the most sought-after foods, and they ate primarily acorns and beech nuts. However, traveling in flocks made them more easily hunted in large numbers. As our European immigrant ancestors continued to settle further and further west, there was frequently a shortage of food supplies, especially in the winter, and especially protein. This tasty source of protein flying overhead was a great temptation to add to the diet. Other factors contributing to the killing of these pigeons included concerns over crop damage from the large migrating flocks. In addition, two inventions, the railroad and the telegraph in the mid-1800s, allowed professional hunters to be notified of the location of the flocks in real time and provided transportation to those areas where large numbers of birds could be killed in a short time. Rail also increased the capability of shipping large amounts of freshly killed meat back to population centers. When the numbers of birds were so large, people came to believe that the populations could not be destroyed. In the mid-1800s, John James Audubon insisted that birds were so plentiful in North America that no human activity, whether hunting, the encroachment of cities and farmlands, or any other act of man, could extinguish a species. However, within 50 years, following the reports of noisy clouds of birds traveling across the landscape, the killing of millions of pigeons proved that assumption to be wrong. A little over half a century after Audubon's death, the last passenger pigeon died in captivity in 1914. Bird feathers have been used in native art forms around the world over the centuries. Some of these practices have resulted in major threats to bird populations from human activity. These practices occurred around the world, in the Americas, in Europe, in the Islamic Middle East, and in China. We know from historical records in China dating back over 2,000 years that bird feathers were used to create mosaics, decorative fans, wall screens, and fine jewelry for women. In China, this art form was most highly developed by using the feathers of the Southeast Asian Kingfishers. Let's go to the next slide. Artisans began by molding fine silver or copper into artistic shapes, which could then be covered by gluing the iridescent blue kingfisher feathers into patterns, typically representing floral arrangements. It is interesting to note that the iridescent color of the blue plumage was not from pigment, but rather from a prism-like effect of the iridescent feathers, which reflected the blue light. And you can almost get an inkling of that from this photograph. The next photograph. This artwork required the capture of multiple birds, as these kingfishers were typically small birds with only a small number of feathers which carried the iridescent property. You can see on the shoulders of this bird coming out of the water, the iridescent feathers were they say typically 10 feathers on each wing and another 8 feathers on the tail. And those were the only feathers that they could use for this artwork. So they had to capture a large number of birds in order to make to use this in their art creations. The last two pictures were of the common kingfisher, which is a kingfisher species that occurs in Europe and all across Asia. So this species was one of the most common used for the Chinese artwork. And then the following picture will show the white-throated kingfisher, which was actually the most prized bird for this artwork. This is a bird native to Cambodia. And because of that, these, which were the most sought after and the most expensive commissioned pieces, used the feathers of this white-throated kingfisher. Records show that at one time the price of these feathers on the international market was more than the price of an equal weight of gold. In the 12th century, the trade in kingfisher feathers was sufficient to provide the major support for the building of a massive temple complex in the capital of Cambodia, Angkor Wat. This Hindu-Buddhist temple complex is considered to be the largest religious building complex in the world, covering an area of over 2 miles in circumference, built on the backs of kingfishers. The next slide showed that the artwork formed many forms. These small pieces of jewelry show how the kingfisher feathers were glued into the metal backgrounds that had been created by the artist. At times, there were some attempts to control the slaughter of these birds. In the early 12th century, the Ming Dynasty brought in an era of austerity. So their solution to controlling the slaughter was to make the birds more valuable, restricting the sale of these kingfisher feathers to be worn only by royalty or the Mandarin class. The next slide will show a larger piece. Well, no, this shows earrings, again showing the intricacy of some of this work, just spectacular. Then the next slide shows some of the larger pieces. This wedding headdress. The notes say that the cost of such items was equivalent to the taxes of several villages. And one more slide. Again, a large piece, just showing the variety of things that were done with these feathers. Although there were some attempts to reduce the number of birds killed, some of the hunters only removed the iridescent feathers and the tail, and the feathers from the tail and wings, and then released the birds. Although it's not clear how those birds survived after that was done. This art form continued until the Cultural Revolution in the 1940s, when it was banned. The next slide shows the relatives that we deal with. This is the belted kingfisher, which we see in our harbor here and around the island. And this bird, of course, is not iridescent. It's not hunted. And it's actually quite common on the shallow bays and estuaries and around the lakes that we have on the island. The kingfishers as a family nest in holes that are dug out of the soft dirt of steep banks. And since that type of habitat is rather scarce, it does reduce the number of kingfishers that we see. This bird, and the next slide showing the female, and usually in the bird world, the male is the more colorful one, but in this species, this female has the little extra color. Even though these birds look quite different than the birds that are iridescent, they act the same way. They fish by either sitting on a branch or hovering over the water and then diving into the water and bringing fish out of the water. The next slide. Many of the threats to bird populations resulted from the demands of women's fashion. By the late 1800s, it became evident that the heavily hunted bird species, such as the passenger pigeon, and also the birds with decorated feathers, such as the egrets, were being threatened by this trade. The next slide shows the snowy egret, and this is a bird that's fairly common in Southern California and along the West Coast, but not in the Northwest. At least I've rarely seen. I don't think I've seen them here at all. And the next slide shows their cousin, which is one more slide, which is the great egret. This bird is about the same size as the great blue heron, and does not have the colorful feet. And it also does not have quite the plumage that we just saw in the last picture. The heron populations, similar to the passenger pigeons, were also vulnerable because of their practice of nesting in colonies. It was a common thing for a rookery of several hundred birds to be attacked by the plume hunters, and in 2 or 3 days utterly destroyed. 2 or 3 days to utterly destroy several hundred nests, which are up in the tall trees sometimes. I mean, and that's quite a feat. The plume trade was a sordid business. Hunters killed and skinned the mature birds, leaving orphaned hatchlings to starve or be eaten by crows. Let's go back 2 slides. Yeah, or that one. Yeah, no, just one slide. Back in the bed. The main drivers of the plume trade were millinery centers in New York and London. William Hornaday, the director of the New York Zoological Society and chief taxidermist at the Smithsonian, calculated that a single 9-month period, the London market had consumed feathers from 130,000 egrets. And again, similar to the kingfishers, in the late 1800s, the price for the most valuable of these fluffy feathers, which occurred just during breeding season, again, were worth this more than the same weight of gold. Next slide. Another picture of the breeding plumage that was so attractive, and women love to put it on their heads. The next slide shows, well, you can see how elaborate some of these were. And one more slide. Yes, the great blue heron. No, back. There you go. Thank you. And you can see this during breeding season, the great blue heron has these additional feathers that are on the breast and also on the back, but not nearly as fluffy and gossamer as the egrets, and of course these were rarely used for artwork. The great blue herons also have collective roosting sites, and we have some here on Bainbridge Island. And we commonly see the great blue herons in our shallow bays, on the dock, in bays around the island.
That's Henrietta.
I was just going to mention that some of us, thank you, Sheila, for identifying Henrietta. Sheila has adopted Henrietta as her personal pet.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, I think it's that way, other way around.
But Victorian, let's go on the next slide. Victorian era fashion included large hats with wide brims, decorated in elaborate creations of silk flowers, ribbons, and exotic plumes. Some of these even included entire exotic birds that had been stuffed. And egrets were not the only species under threat. In 1886, more than 50 North American species were being slaughtered for their feathers. One ornithologist reported taking 2 walks in Manhattan in 1886 and counting of 700 hats he counted, 525 of them were topped with bird feathers. Toward the end of the 19th century, a movement to stop the killing of birds for women's fashion was developing in the British Isles and in the United States. The movement against the plume trade in Britain led to the establishment of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in London in 1889. And in 1896, a passionate amateur naturalist, Harriet Lawrence Hemingway, a Boston Brahmin, read an article describing the plume trade and determined to do something to stop the killing of the herons. She enlisted the help of her cousin, Minna Hall, and they consulted the Blue Book, Boston's social register, and launched a series of tea parties at which they urged their friends to stop wearing the feathered hats and asked the women to join a society for the protection of birds, especially the egret. Some 900 women joined this upper crust boycott. These 2 women cousins that same year organized the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and interested members in more than a dozen states joined them. Their federation would eventually become the National Audubon Society. During the first decade of the 20th century, the movement to protect endangered wildlife gained the support of President Theodore Roosevelt. And in 1903, a small island off the coast of Florida was designated Pelican Island and set aside as the first federal bird reservation, leading to the establishment of the National Wildlife Refuge System. In 1900, the Audubon Society successfully pushed for legislation which prohibited transport across state lines of birds taken in violation of state laws. In 1913, Congress passed a law which effectively ended the plume trade. In 1920, the Supreme Court upheld a subsequent piece of legislation, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for the majority, declared that the protection of birds was in the national interest. Without such measures, he declared, one could foresee a day when no birds would survive for any power, state or federal, to regulate. Threats to bird populations continue, although legislation has had a significant impact on the rate of bird destruction. Hunting of some birds continues as they are seen as competition to fishing or are hunted as sources for human food. Climate change impacts populations of fish and other food sources for birds, and new chemicals are used as insecticides and herbicides, which poison the environment. A major contribution to the protection of birds was made by Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist who specialized in wildlife ecology. However, she is best known for Silent Spring, published in 1962. Critiques of this book wrote that Carson's ecological vision of the oceans shows her embrace of a large environmental ethic, which could lead to the sustainability of nature's interdependent systems. Climate change, rising sea levels, melting Arctic glaciers, collapsing bird and animal populations, all are part of Carson's work. In review, she's been called perhaps the finest nature writer in the 20th century. During the post-war years after World War II, the widespread use of organic chemical pesticides inspired Mrs. Carson to write her critique of how humans use these products to control agriculture and at the same time ignore the destructive effects that they may have on the natural world that we are a part of. Her detailed research led her to conclude that the use of DDT endangered multiple bird species. The next slide shows a brown pelican. In the 1940s, the use of pesticides such as DDT, the brown pelicans along the Gulf Coast and in Southern California had almost completely disappeared. With some of the most dramatic changes had occurred in the rapid decline of the population of this population compared to other birds, but also declining were peregrine falcons and other species, including bald eagles. She embarked on a thorough research into what was causing these declines and concluded that the generalized use of pesticides was contaminating water supplies, polluting the soil, and poisoning crops. Research by she and others showed that the pesticide DDT caused the thinning of the eggshells of the brown pelicans, who subsisted on fish from polluted waters. This work eventually resulted in the banning of DDT in this country and designating the pelicans as an endangered species. Of course, there was a strong pushback from agriculture and chemical producers. However, she convinced Congress to act. Her work resulted in restoration of viable populations of several birds, including the brown pelican and the peregrine falcons. As a result of continued decline of several species, President Nixon called on Congress to improve the federal government's programs to preserve wildlife in danger of extinction. This led to passing of the Endangered Species Act in 1972 at the urging of President Nixon. Within years, the population had increased to several thousand of the pelicans, including populations on the California coast and also the Gulf Coast. One other success story to use as an example of how varied the threats to bird populations are was the story of the restoration of the population of the California condor. This vulture is the largest bird in North America with a wingspan of 9.5 feet. By the mid-1900s, the condors had been dying in larger numbers for a number of years. The threat to these birds was from pollution from lead. The lead source was the ammunition which was used to kill deer and small game, which was left in the field. In 1967, the Endangered Species Preservation Act provided the first federal protection to the condors. This is 1967. Following the signing of the Endangered Species Act in 1972, the following year, a condor recovery team was formed in spite of to coordinate activity to try to preserve the population. In spite of a very active program of captive breeding and attempts to protect the population in the wild, there was a continued decline in the population until 1986. In that year, there were only 3 condors remaining in the wild, although there were some captive populations at the San Diego Zoo, the Los Angeles Zoo, and a couple of other zoos over the next decade. In a very controversial program, these 3 birds were then captured and included in the captive breeding program. So there were no condors in the wild from 1986 for another, I think, 15 years. Over the next 15 years, gradual release along with the attached tracking devices, which you can see on the wings of this bird here. And then they would capture these birds and check them for lead poisoning. And they were actually able to treat them by injecting antidotes to the lead, which would allow the birds to continue to survive. But lead poisoning, when left untreated, caused the birds to die. Despite much skepticism about the possibility of the success of this restoration program, the population has now increased over 400 adult birds, including captive and wild populations, in California, Arizona, and Mexico. Just against all odds. My wife and I were fortunate enough to see over a dozen spectacular birds along the Big Sur coast in the June of 2015. You can see one more slide of another condor.
Nope, that's the end.
That's the end of the pictures. Wildlife protection is never a static program. The Condor Protection Program continues to be a success because of ongoing monitoring, capture of birds from the wild with testing for lead, and treatment as needed. The continued success of this program involves multiple staff and volunteers and considerable expense. Part of this recovery program has been helped by phasing out lead ammunition in the hunting of wildlife in California. In July of 2019, the final phase out occurred, and lead ammunition for hunting in the wild was totally banned since July of 2019. An integral part of the discussion on climate change includes consideration of the effects of human activity on warming temperatures, on pollution, and the resultant threats to wildlife populations. We must continue to be vigilant to protect the successful programs that have been developed in the past. In 2019, the Trump administration succeeded in weakening portions of the Endangered Species Act. And again in January of this year, additional limitations on the Endangered Species Act were implemented. Competing priorities with agriculture and industry require us to make sometimes difficult decisions regarding how we treat the environment in which we live. The best that we can do is to recognize that challenges will continue to change, and we will do our best to remain diligent to protect what we value. And that's the end.
Well, that is the beginning, really. Thank you so much, Howard. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation, and
well, thank you.
And although sobering, it also is enlightening that it is not. We are not without hope.
Mhm.